Good afternoon in Ireland and good morning in Colombia. My name is Patricia Cortez. I'm Colombian ambassador in Dublin. Welcome all to the Fireside Talk, Diverse Thinking for a Sustainable Future, with Dr. Brigitte Baptiste and Professor Yvonne Buckley, included in Brigitte 2022, Dublin City Celebrated Women. First of all, I would like to thank the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Alison Gilliland, for her kind invitation to be part of this first Brigitte celebration. Thank you as well for all her team for the support in this event. It's an honor, a real honor for the Colombian Embassy to be part of this series of events inspired by Brigitte, the Celtic goddess of creativity and wisdom. We are delighted to celebrate women all over the world, highlighting their stories and recognize their contribution to our society. Therefore, we're very happy to have our two guests today, both leading prominent education institutions in sustainability in Colombia and in Ireland. Colombia is very privileged in terms of biodiversity, variety of climates, is one of the mega diverse countries in the world and has more than 300 ecosystems. Just one example, there are more bird species in Colombia than in any other country on earth. But being blessed with this natural wealth, which we are very proud of, is also a great responsibility to all Colombians. Hence, why the Colombian government is leading and implementing policies to guarantee and to work towards the protection and addressing the challenges as well. The efforts in environmental protection involve the participation of the local communities, in particular indigenous Afro-Colombians, but as well in the academia, school children, city mayors, teachers, university, private sector, among others. It has to be as well a recognition of their knowledge and cultural diversity when we talk about the local communities. The philosophy, for example, of a way of life of indigenous communities in Colombia is one example of that. Or the case in the Llanos, which is in the eastern plains of Colombia, constitutes source of inspiration to fight creative and respectful ways to protect this natural wealth. Last year, during the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, the Colombian president presented ambitious commitments, among others, to have 30% of the Colombian territory as protected area, while we are leading as well an energy transition. So these commitments, of course, require, again, not only the government requires like all of us to be involved. Before introducing the panelists, I would like to thank Dr. Baptiste and Professor Buckley for their generosity and for their enthusiasm to participate in this conversation. They both promote a deeper knowledge of our biodiversity as a path to guarantee a sustainable future. Brigitte Baptiste is a Colombian cultural landscape ecologist, biodiversity expert, and a transgender woman activist. She served as director of the Alexander von Humboldt Biological Resources Research Institute, a leading research center in Colombia from 2011 until 2019. In September 2019, Dr. Baptiste became the president of the EAN University, university that promotes a strongly sustainable entrepreneurship to provide resources for society and the planet. Brigitte Baptiste is a biologist from the Universidad Javeriana and specialized in tropical conservation and development. She has PhD honoris causa in environmental management from UNIPAS. Accompanying Dr. Baptiste, we have Professor of Zoology at Trinity College Dublin, Yvonne Buckley, who was named the institution's Vice-president for Biodiversity in 2021. She's the co-champion of the Smart and Sustainable Planet research team and a co-director of Nature Plus, the Trinity Center for Biodiversity and Sustainable Nature-Based Solutions. Professor Buckley is interested in the development of ecology as a discipline. She's vice-president for the British Ecological Society and co-chair of the All-Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network and senior editor of the Journal of Ecology. She's active in mentoring women in higher education at all levels. Professor Buckley has a degree in biology from Oxford University and has a PhD from Imperial College London Dr. Baptiste, Professor Buckley, you are both very welcome. We are very pleased and honored. I honestly can't say more the word honored to have you both. The floor is all yours. Thanks to all the attendees for being with us today. We are all sure that you're going to enjoy this great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you so much to Brigitte for being with me today. So the Celtic goddess Brigitte is associated with creativity and wisdom, and you share her name and no doubt some of her best attributes as well. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're going to kick off. I'm fascinated by the parallels between cultural diversity and biodiversity. So, for example, it's been found that in really rugged mountainous areas, there's often really high numbers of indigenous languages, as well as an explosion of different kinds of species, numbers of animals and plants. So can you tell me about the parallels that you see between cultural diversity and biodiversity?
Well, I very much agree with your view about how the kind of ecological roughness or density of environmental conditions creates heterogeneity, and then people that comes there has to discover and name and get adapted to those conditions. The growing field of neuroecology is telling us how the different strains of humanity have located in different places and have developed their cultures, drinking from those those relations that are being built through history. So if you have a variety of environments where people has to adapt, then you have a plentiful of cultural responses and different ways of adapting, even if you don't think that there's such a diversity of environments. For example, in the Amazon, you used to think that the Amazon is a flat rainforest with a little landscape diversity, but then when you go there, you see that the soils, that the plants, biogeography, and the dynamics of the climate is quite different in different places. So you start to learn how different tribes evolve, and they have their own languages and ways of naming the place and behaving and ruling the relation towards plants and animals. So yes, there's a huge evidence about the spatial and living heterogeneity of the planet and the cultural diversity, and we have to preserve that, of course. That's one of our, I think, our tasks today.
Absolutely. And do you think that kind of different languages cause you to see the natural world in different ways, if you like? I know in Irish we have words for colors that you only apply to that color in nature. So red for something artificial has got a different Irish word than red in nature. So actually we see the world differently when we use the full diversity of language and names for words that we have at our disposal.
Yeah, that's fundamental, and it's the acknowledgements of the beauty of the world and the beauty on human mind as well. How can we appreciate and discover things through conversation? Because if you talk to me about things that I cannot name in from your country, I will absolutely be delighted to try to discover them and understand what they mean, and try to get to create a relationship and a nice relationships and to enjoy the existence of difference.
That's great. So we have geographical diversity, the ruggedness of the landscape, which gives rise to biological diversity, and that gives rise, then the ruggedness of the landscape can also give rise to cultural diversity, and we then have this, kind of neurological diversity or ways of understanding the world, the diversity of ways of understanding the world, depending on what kinds of languages and people we have around us. So that's just fascinating.
And that makes us, it creates the obligation to talk to other people, to really know better how they live, how is their world, how do they access to this world, and create agreements to respect their views and their territories and the diversity that's linked to the cultural ways of living. So if you have many cultural views about the world, you need to create more, I think, a larger dialogue and a larger conversation. And of course, it means a bit of complexity. So diversity calls for governance complexity. And perhaps we can talk a bit later on the subject, because too much diversity sometimes scares people, but it's because you need to participate, to engage in larger conversations, and that's sometimes a bit of uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing. I might just pursue that one a little bit. You know, it's kind of the cost of diversity, I guess, is that you have to spend more time trying to understand and come up with a common language to start discussing things. If you have lots of people with different views, it's fantastic for getting ideas in the room, but coming up with a common way of understanding a problem can take a lot of work, actually, when you're sitting around a table discussing a problem from diverse points of view. So how can we do that better?
Well, I think that's been part of the history of humanity, to try not to impose our local views on other people's views about their places. Sadly, this also has had lots of backlashes because of colonialism and people that think that the world can be only named by one way, in one way, and so imposing languages, imposing cultural views or interpretations, which at the end are completely or completely not, but are generally useless, because they don't have the deep understanding of what is being named, or about the value of the land, the species, the facts. So anytime you try to explain other people's life in your own terms, you're reducing the richness of this interpretation, and you're sometimes even exercising violence and disrespect to the capacities of other people's views. So that's why we always have to call upon conversation, cooperation, and call for not just respectful ways of living and talking to others, but inviting others to express themselves freely and enjoy the difference. And that's quite the most complex thing, because you always feel difference as a threat, or you feel that the other people will try to impose their views on yours. So dialogue, conversation, negotiation, and diplomatic activities such as this conversation here, promoted by the Lord Mayor and the Colombian Embassy.
Great. Yeah, so we're both ecologists, right? We're both kind of trained as ecologists, and we know that human activities like intensification of agriculture, land use change, deforestation, overfishing, this long litany of things that we're doing wrong with the world. And that's leading to dangerous levels of climate change and biodiversity change. And I guess, you know, what's the role of our discipline of ecology, you know, ecologists, in trying to address these drivers of biodiversity loss? And maybe we could talk a bit about what ecologists can do by themselves, and, you know, how they need to reach out as well, you know, and maybe talk across disciplines to find the solutions that we need.
Yeah, that's great. I love well, I don't do too much ecology nowadays, but because of my duty. But ecology, I think, has two major duties towards knowledge. The first one is to convey an idea of complexity, that things are connected and disconnected during time and space, or through different time and spatial scales. So there's plenty of species, there's plenty of varieties of genetic diversity all around the world. There's climatic variability. There's plenty of issues, entities, and things that keep moving and connecting over time and space. And this idea helps us lots to try not to get fixed on just one idea of nature, one idea of stability, and allows us to think in evolution, in positive change, and in creating ways of life that can be better, not just for us, but for the whole planet. So I think the way we work as ecologists is very important to convey this complexity. And as a second kind of duty, we can invite people to think themselves as part of the ecosystem, as dynamic and creative entity that can decide on which species, which places, which functions can we connect or can we manage for the better, of course. And it makes us think on how the transformations of the planet that we have provoked are good or bad for us at the local level, but perhaps not as good for everybody at the global level. So you can get, or the opposite, to the global people that think that they are doing nice, are taking nice decisions for the sake of the humanity, but perhaps they're not that good for the local people. And that's the case for about mining or about the exploitation of natural resources at a particular place, or when we talk about pollution and we talk about agricultural production. So there's always different types of effects and connections that we have to be aware. So inviting people to feel them part of the ecosystem is quite important, I think.
Yeah. So ecologists are kind of pre-adapted to being good at understanding complex systems and complex problems because of the complex nature and the ever-changing nature of those interactions between life and life's relationship with the Earth systems that support it as well. I think that's a great point. And I definitely agree with you about humans being part of the ecosystems. And I think for too long we've thought about ecology without taking humans into account so much, except as outside forces that come in and kind of threaten stuff without thinking about humans actually embedded in the ecosystems. So if ecologists started to think about humans as more embedded in the ecosystems and part of the ecology, do you think that would change the way that we think about how ecosystems function as well?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I know that Ireland has beautiful landscapes and has a long history of transformation of your ecosystems, and also a very interesting tradition on attachment to the land, and that is quite something that we feel about the Irish culture. But it happens everywhere, and everybody is aware of this connection that we need to have to the land and we need to have to other species. But perhaps because we are now displaced to cities, to big cities, that we have reached a level of dependence of technology that doesn't allow us to see our connections with land or with the ecological processes. We seem to be detached from living and organic processes, but we all depend on the living processes of the world. We all depend on atmosphere and water and food that is being produced at, as I mentioned, at different scales. So I would say to bringing back the people to Earth in terms of at least awareness, at least this feeling that that we cannot live outside of anything. We are part, as you mentioned, but it's quite complicated. I find that ecologists, we need to be better communicators, because communication is also creating connections, and then we need to talk to certain type of people here and other people in other places and in other scales, and bring kind of the message from those different streams of reality. So kind of I think a mercurial duty in terms of Greek mythology, since we are talking about a bit of mythology here. And I don't know if Saint Brigitte of the goddess had that kind of capacity to talk with animals, to talk with nature, and bring this to the attention of others people, to the kings or to the lay people.
That's super interesting. I think we're going to talk a bit more about traditional ecological knowledge in a minute, so park that thought. Okay. And we'll come on to that again, I think. Yeah, so going from the local scale and connections to land and you know, being embedded in you know, in nature and the values that it brings to us, I'm going to zoom out now to kind of the international scale and just talk about your involvement in international policy. So I think
Okay.
you were involved in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So can you talk to me a little bit about why this international kind of level of engagement is important right now?
Well, that's an acknowledgement, I think, by humans that we live and share a planet. That we cannot really take control of the ecological processes of the planet from any particular country because our experience is limited, and then there's no way that the Panama or Angola or Taiwan takes control over the world's ecology. So it's a commons. We are sharing a common. Therefore, we need institutions to discuss how should we manage the world ecosystems, at least the larger scale processes that that create the conditions for all the humans to thrive and live. The only way to do that is through a platform, a place where all the governments and experts and people can meet together and talk and bring their knowledge and their experience and ask shared questions about what's happening, for example, with global fisheries, or what's going on with big forests such as the Amazon or the Congo Basin or the tundra in Russia, and try to understand what is behind those processes or changes, and what are the effects of the global interactions of living beings and our own activities, economic activities and cultural activities. So the IPBES is that kind of platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's 9 years old now. It's not that old. It's quite young. Even if before the IPBES there were some efforts to bring countries to discuss the global ecology in the same table. And this platform is aimed to assess the status of biodiversity and the trends of ecological and ecosystem services, and also to understand better the links between culture, policy, and this ecological functioning of the world. So it's quite interesting, of course, and it's made from, I guess nowadays it's 130, 140 countries that have signed the agreement, and the IPBES meets once a year. Now it's once every 2 years because of the pandemics and budget restrictions, but has a panel, a multi-stakeholders expert panel, which is called the MEP. And everything in United Nations systems and vocabulary has acronyms, awful acronyms, such as IPBES, which is not nice to pronounce. But, and the IPBES just takes the word from countries that suggest what a way forward. So, for example, we are ending, and I'm part of one of the assessments of IPBES. I was part of the MEP in the past, but nowadays not anymore. Which is dedicated to analyze the ways societies and countries value biodiversity, which is a huge question. To ask countries why is important biodiversity for you, and any country also has to ask their own communities and everybody why is important biodiversity for you, and of course, if we can value properly using different methods, which are the best methods to assess the importance of biodiversity. Where market values are important because we can put a price on something, but of course it's completely restricted to those goods and functions and that can be really part of the market. And in the case of biodiversity, we know that there are very little of them. But still, the question about valuing property, valuing and giving the importance, or acknowledging the importance of biodiversity is paramount. So, and Ireland is part of the IPBES, of course, and it's been always an active party of those assessments.
Great. And traditional ecological knowledge has been emphasized by IPBES as one of the, one of the ways in which you can elicit those values from people is trying to figure out what it is that they know about the ecology of their own places and how they value biodiversity. So it helps us to tease out, I guess, the many different dimensions of nature's contributions to people. Scientific ways of knowing are absolutely important. We're both scientists, we agree on that, I think. But this traditional ecological knowledge can also be incredibly illuminating and enlightening about how people understand their own ecosystems. So, how can that traditional ecological knowledge or diverse viewpoints from different kinds of people help us in the biodiversity crisis?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned the word traditional because, and we are not using that word nowadays, but that's because there's quite complex to say if something is traditional or not. But it doesn't mean that tradition doesn't exist and there's not very valuable knowledge that is found on traditions. But that's a discussion more in terms of policy and what are the implications of saying if something is or not traditional. But traditional ecological knowledge as well as local ecological knowledge and all types of knowledge that comes from a long relation of culture, society, and territory are quite important because, as you mentioned, they hold perhaps the key of understanding ecological processes that need long pieces of time or long chunks of space that need to travel, to talk, to create mental models and worldviews that are important for making decisions. And therefore, this knowledge has been privileged in IPBES as quite important source of policy making. And IPBES has tried to create a way to move from this knowledge towards making more sensible decisions and more respectful decisions also with the local people. Because if you have been living in a place for 3,000 years, 4,000 years, and you inherited a particular way of understanding nature, of living in nature, and doing things, and you have also created a narrative about the way you share the space with animals and plants. That's quite valuable. That's quite important, not just because of utilitarian purposes, but also because it's on your heart. It's yourself, your own sense of self is linked to this history and process. So there's a big commitment from IPBES with human rights and with local communities to avoid the imposition of management decisions that come from other places where perhaps it's more complicated to acknowledge the importance of small things that are not visible for the foreigners or for the outsiders. And this creates, of course, a huge discussion on how scales interact from the local to the global, which I think is the great challenge that we still face for the future. But at least it creates a way where local people, local experts, indigenous persons, and other people that are really which really value the local conditions of the ecosystems participate in the dialogue and raise a hand and flag an attention of very important things that happen at the local level and can be lost in the global view.
Absolutely, there's this tension, isn't there, between the local level and the local solutions and the context dependency of a lot of the ecology and the ecological problems that we talk about, and these top-down solutions and top-down bodies that try and get a general idea of what's going on. And I think that's true of ecology as well as these policy processes, that there is this tension between the top-down generalizable aspects and the bottom-up sort of context-dependent processes.
Yeah, and you know that policy nowadays is made by nations, and nations are quite a strong statement in terms of governance and rights, and they have different regimes for understanding their territory. and there's of course a natural diversity of ideologies and ways of building institutions. So countries, as part of IPBES, some of them are reluctant to consider small-scale local communities because the nation concept is very strong and needed to for the sake of the full society. So there's tensions about including large nations that are not really countries at this moment, which is what many indigenous communities in the world now are claiming. That, well, we are not even considered seriously by our countries. We should have a place in IPBES as by our own in our own capacities. It's complex because it's a platform made of countries, and it's not a platform that allows indigenous communities to have a stake or vote directly. Well, this tension is something that we try to address in our meetings.
Wow, we're covering a lot of ground in this conversation. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to switch tacks slightly now, and I'm going to talk about your role as president of EAN University. So it's a university that's set itself a challenge of being a benchmark institution for education and research in sustainable entrepreneurship. So first of all, what is sustainable entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's of course the key concept behind my transition from a research institution such as Humboldt that deals with biodiversity and my role as ecologist in Colombia towards a business school, because what I'm doing now is to chair a business school board that has more than 60 programs, and mostly it's they're related to administration, accounting, international business, and at some point engineering, and then chemistry, which is the closest program we go to the natural world, to say, or to ecosystems, but with the purpose of moving from the traditional way of doing business, or the economy based on competing business that destroy that being destroyed one and on the other, and create synergies and a perspective of doing a different kind of business that are good for nature, business that have a different ethics in terms of the people that are involved in them, businesses that are willing to collaborate, to create synergies, to participate in a more circular economy, which is part of a similar of the way ecosystems work, and to really be willing to sacrifice a bit of the monetary obsession of earnings, and to invest those earnings in creating ecological safety, to solving inequities in the world. That means a whole new definition of businesses, which is not ours, of course. There's plenty of new ways of thinking on entrepreneurship in the world. So what we promote is this kind of entrepreneurship by people, and also trying to make young investors and people who has the capacity to lead an entrepreneur and an enterprise to do that with a different set of principles, with a different ethic.
That's fascinating, because it's become very clear to me recently that it's the students that we have in our universities today and next year and the year after. They're going to be the CEOs of the world. They're going to be in charge of the world by 2050, when we hope to get to a net zero carbon world. That's what we need to get to in order to save our own skins. So the students that we're training today are the ones that we will be relying on in our old age to keep this world turning and to keep our ecosystems working. So it's so important to get those messages, those values, those new ways of living and learning and working, to start training the people who are going to inherit the earth, so that's fascinating.
And then we are really promoting the generation of new leaders who has the capacity to create those options, those pathways because we need them to be bold and perhaps break some of the obstacles and the status quo restrictions that make businesses to stay on the safe zone. But I think that these new generations that are coming to the universities, they really don't want to be employees of the same old-fashioned businesses, but they want to lead to somewhere else, and they want to change structures, and they want to change laws, behaviors, and even I'm sure that we are falling short on giving them the knowledge and the capacities to do that. But that's what universities have to do, to create conditions for this conversation, to create the space, the safe space for breaking the rules without creating chaos, but creating different options for the future. So it's amazing to be in a university, of course, and to hear what the students have to ask and question in relation to environmental management, in relation to policies, in relations to business and rights.
You're right. You know, we can teach so much, but they're the ones who are going to come up with the brilliant ideas, the ways to do it. So by creating the space, by creating an atmosphere in which they can feel free to disrupt, to think outside the box, that's just so important.
Yeah, that's why universities have to allow all the, I would say, the nasty discussions that nobody else wants to held, we have to protect freedom of speech, and we have to protect all types of ideological conceptions, and to provide the tools to everybody to discuss that in peace, and to experiment also in new ways of designing institutions, new technologies, to give meaning to those new values that are emerging everywhere towards nature. And well, that's a huge task to do, and to provide this universal frame for everybody to find a new way to do things.
That's it. I mean, we need to teach them to disrupt and to challenge, and to have the evidence base behind them, so that they can go in confidently in those conversations and think their way through the problems, and challenge where they think that ideas are not based on evidence, or are completely ideological, or that kind of thing. So having those conversations is really important, and giving our students the tools to be able to have those conversations safely and effectively.
And that's quite a challenge, because you mentioned evidence-based, and the issue of evidence is, I think, the most challenging issue nowadays in science, because people doesn't understand very well how is science done, and how ecology as part of a scientific discipline, or as a scientific discipline, works. And complexity sometimes scares us, and they say, well, no, science is too complex. You need also lots of faith, such as in the case of vaccines, to accept or not a vaccine, because you don't understand what is DNA modification, or what is immunosuppressation. I cannot pronounce it as well as in English. So there's lots of arguments against certain types of evidence that are being produced everywhere, and ideology is now, I think, gaining a bit of space, just because it feels safer to stay on your beliefs and your experience, without really challenging the source of this knowledge. So the relation of evidence and beliefs is again on the table, and we as ecologists have to be careful dealing with that, because we don't want to create conflict. But what we want to do is to see how languages, how methods, how ways of producing knowledge is affecting decision making.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like we could have a much longer conversation than an hour.
I'm sure of that. So I have to go to Ireland then to celebrate.
Absolutely.
Next year.
Absolutely. So I've got one more question, and again, this is a question that could take another hour to answer, but we'll try and keep it to about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll go to questions from from the audience. So we often look for gender differences in how leaders respond to challenges. So women leaders, for example, were lauded for their role in the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, or you know, because women leaders, I guess, are rarer in society, they come under a lot more scrutiny for their leadership, perhaps. So do you think gender plays a role in how we lead through the global crises of climate and biodiversity change, for example? What do women leaders bring to the table here?
Oh, definitely. I think women are making the difference. And that's because gender is also a cultural category that it's built through this neural ecological process that we were talking about earlier. So the notion of who has rights because of a particular biology, a particular anatomy, or a particular body has, I would say, a plagued history of many societies in the world, excluding women from decisions, from participating in better terms in decisions and in the society, mostly because women were seen as mothers or as workers and not as intellectual and scientists or persons with all the capacities to perform any task. So what is happening is that the concept of woman is changing everywhere, and women are just saying that the world cannot stay on this biological reduction about roles and duties, and that's why everywhere women are starting to gain positions and to enjoy and the human rights they deserve. But what we need perhaps to be aware of is that we as women are not claiming a biological right, biologically based right. It's not because of our bodies, it's because of the previous exclusion, it's because of history of discrimination, of violence, and womanhood now is built upon the emergence of the values of femininity in many cultures, and that's why it's so important that women participation in governments, in institutions, and in everything really makes a reference to history of exclusion, to history of pain, to history of discrimination. Because if not, just the feminine body in a power position doesn't mean that things will change. And that's why, and me as a transgender woman have to always acknowledge that it's history which makes feminism and ecofeminism an absolutely powerful and valuable movement nowadays.
That's great. I think it's a great point to pause our conversation for a minute and ask if there's any questions from the audience, because we can carry on talking about. Okay, here we go. So here we got a question from Andy. So one of the greatest dilemmas we face today is how to reconcile development and conservation. How can developed countries support sustainable development in the global south?
Yeah, that's the way, the best way to describe the contradictions that we have built on building well-being, human well-being, and sacrificing the source of that well-being, which is a nonsense equation. You just cannot try to live better, destroying the fundaments or the basis of this same well-being. But this is allowed because well-being is produced in some places, and the cost of this well-being is borne by some places, such in the south, as you mentioned, in the south in many senses, no, in the south as a place of inequity even in most northern countries. But I won't go on that. But yeah, I think environmental justice is perhaps the way of understanding the challenge we have to reconcile development and conservation, because we all have to, let's say, to pay our dues in terms of our consumption, in terms of our well-being, the way we do things nowadays, and we cannot ignore that we are causing a footprint in the ecosystems, and we have to acknowledge that sometimes this footprint is far away, and we have to be responsible for this footprint despite the distance in time and space. And I think that's the meaning of the word sustainability. That's to becoming aware of our impact as persons, as communities, as families, as countries. And then the discussion becomes much easier if we just get aware of that.
Yeah, this kind of harks back to previously we were talking about this disconnection from the land as perhaps being one of the reasons why we don't quite understand why ecosystem services are important, because we're disconnected from where they're provided. And I think we were talking about Ireland in that case, but then we start to think about the ecosystem services that we're provided with from, all over the world, and we're even more disconnected from, the impacts of deforestation in South America, for example, or Indonesia, on our consumption of products in Ireland, or what we eat and what we buy and all of that. It's those supply lines are very diffuse. We don't see the impacts of what we're doing, and that's a very important thing for us to understand. If we really want to fix things, then we need to know where it is that we're having an impact with everything that we buy and produce.
Yeah,
okay.
and trade is quite a key here.
Yeah.
Trade. How do we trade goods and services and at different scales? Because through trade you can compensate adequately and completely this footprint, but trade nowadays is not doing that. It's very, very weak in terms of helping us to compensate our human footprint, and this is, I think, equally valid for local trade and for global trade.
Great. Okay, we've got another question, an anonymous question. So how is the increasing female contribution to science, technology, engineering, and maths shaping these disciplines? So we've seen more women coming into these disciplines. How do you think that's shaping their development?
That's great, because women are really challenging the previous ideas of stability. They're really challenging even the scientific method and the ways we understood categories, procedures, and of course the truths that have been built through history. Since knowledge history has been built mostly through men's minds, of course you lose an important chunk of reality. So women scientists are just completing the task, but at the same time are revealing the flaws that these knowledge systems were affected or created. And I think so that women scientists are helping us to reframe knowledge in, I would say, in modern traditional terms, but also are opening a place where knowledge can be built with a richer perspective in terms of creativity, in terms of fairness, and they are bringing the world a more complex idea about what is knowledge. In fact, I think that's that's a long conversation, of course.
another great conversation to have over a pint in Dublin at some point.
Please.
Okay. Another great question here from Rupert Cox. So how may the arts help to change the valuation of biodiversity in a country like Colombia?
Oh, that arts are paramount, because if you think in complexity, if you think how difficult it is to convey the idea of an ecosystem that keeps changing, that keeps creating links between different entities through history and time, perhaps the art is the only way, the only resource that we can use in terms of communication to attract people to this otherwise a bit despairing way of thinking on reality. So arts allow us to talk about difficult things. Art also allows us to get involved and to be represented and perform in another way. We can imagine different scenarios for the future. We can imagine different positions of our bodies for the future. So arts, I think, are completely necessary. All types of arts, and not. And I would like to make a note on the issue of greenwashing, because arts can be used also to convey fake news, to convey false ideas of things, and that's why the very nature of art, which is critical thinking, has to be always called one. We cannot allow the reduction of the notion of art towards just marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's then an obligation almost on scientists to collaborate with artists to see what they can produce together. You know, that kind of collaboration could be very, very rich, in fact.
Yeah, and we as scientists sometimes are very in love with our own ideas and world models, and we don't want to really become challenged. Of course, good scientists always love to be challenged, but if you grow old and you have an idea about things, you try to stay attached to those ideas, to those models, and art, it's the best way to challenge them with also passion, but love and the assurance of good intention. The art always is working with the best intention. So that's why we scientists should always work together with artists.
That's a lovely point, I think, on which to end our conversation. So I'm going to pass back. I just want to say thank you so much, Brigitte, for your wisdom and insight. It's been a really super conversation. And thanks again to the Ambassador and the Lord Mayor for organising this event. It's been a real pleasure. So I'll pass back to the Ambassador now.
Well, all the pleasure was mine, Yvonne. Thank you. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Well, thank you, Brigitte. Thank you both, Dr. Baptiste and Professor Buckley. As you said, it's just kind of a beginning of a conversation. So many areas of interest, and I think in a way as well, even for us here in government, very provocative. So it's always good to hear, as you say, on the critical thinking, on this diversity, on this cultural diversity. So I honestly don't think it was a better way for us to celebrate Brigitte's Day, even highlighting that Brigitte has kind of same Brigitte's similarity. We really hope that this engagement. I want to thank again the Lord Mayor for the invitation. Thanks to all the attendees on the questions. Thanks to my team, and thanks to all the teams and as well on your team, Professor Buckley. So looking forward to this celebration of Brigitte's. I think it's a women's celebration. We are doing it, and we definitely will continue on that. And we look forward to have Brigitte here in Ireland, and of course to have the opportunity as well to invite Professor Buckley. I mean, on those many areas that we definitely can keep working. Thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
All right. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ambassador Patricia.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, it was
By the
excellent.
celebration.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.